right, so in this video we're going to cover the breathing mechanisms. Again, it says here slides 24 through 33. This is going to cover some things that, for whatever reason, people will get a little bit confused on. I'll try to make my best to make it clear, but don't let some of the ways things are described here to overwhelm you, because it's common sense. We know what's going on, but when we have to put it into scientific words, sometimes people just use, especially books, just use words that are a little too scientific. No one needs an instruction manual on how to use a straw, but if you had to describe what was going on, it might cause you to have to think a little bit, because it's not anything you think about. So that's what we're going to talk about here, is the breathing mechanisms and what's going to happen. So breathing is referred to as ventilation. It's simply the movement of air from the outside of the body into the bronchial tree into the alveolar. So it has two portions. We have inspiration, which is also called inhalation, and expiration, which is also called exhalation. And so inspiration, bringing air in; expiration, moving it out. One inspiration plus the following expiration is called the respiratory cycle. All right, so the respiratory cycle is breathing in and breathing out. Now, here's where we're going to talk about things that can be a little bit confusing simply because of the verbiage that we use. So, first of all, atmospheric pressure. That's what the world around us, not inside our lungs, the world around us has a pressure, and we call it atmospheric pressure. Now, that is not going to change in a hurry. Now, I can drive from here to Asheville, or take a flight from here to Denver, or whatever, and it'll change relatively quickly, but it's not changing from breath to breath. So atmospheric pressure is going to stay basically the same. What we do is we change the pressure inside our thoracic cavity, which is going to cause, that change of pressure is going to cause air to move in and then be pushed out. And that is respiration. And so we control this by our diaphragm. All right. The diaphragm is what controls this. Now, know that everything's going to move from high pressure to low pressure. Low pressure is basically a vacuum. All right. So if this is always going to be the same, let's say X, what I do here is, to bring air in, I have to make this inside of my thoracic cavity lower than the outside world, and that's going to cause air to come in. If, on the other hand, I want to breathe out, then I have to make this higher pressure in here than out here, and that's going to move air out. Right? So it's always about just moving air from high pressure to low pressure. And so since this is constant, I change the pressure inside of here alternately from high to low, and that's going to cause respiration or breathing, ventilation. So the pressure and volume of gases are inversely related. This is called Boyle's law. Now, one of the ways I remember this is, when I was in school, I was big into chemistry, and this was one of the big laws. And basically it says that there's an inverse relation to pressure and volume. And so, first of all, if I have a can, we'll say a plastic bottle here, and it's got a cap on it, and it has a certain amount of pressure. Let's say we'll just put 2, and I don't even have to put anything, but we'll say atmospheres. 2 atmospheres of pressure, or 2 millimeters of mercury, whatever you want to say. And I take it and I squeeze it, and it doesn't have an opening, all right? But I can indent the sides of the container so that the volume has gotten smaller. All right, I've decreased the volume, but what's going to happen to the pressure is it's going to increase the pressure. All right, because I have more stuff in less space, so it has more pressure. And vice versa, if I expand the walls of this, I'm going to increase the volume, but that decreases the pressure because now I have more room with the same amount of space. Now, I remember this as Boyle's law because hopefully everybody here knows how to boil water. But a little hint, if you ever need to boil water and you are trying to get it to boil quicker, you put a lid on it. And what happens is as the steam comes off the water and it's trapped, it increases the pressure in the container, and that causes the boiling point to drop, making it easier to boil the water. Now, I remembered that as the way to remember Boyle's law about volume and gases, and the name Boyle is simply if I'm boiling water, boil, I put a cap on it and it increases the pressure, increased pressure, and that causes it to boil faster. So I could remember it that way. If that helps, great. I'm sorry if I can't think any other way. So if the pressure inside the alveoli, the little air sacs, decreases, low pressure, right? The atmospheric pressure pushes air into the airways. So I've got this little sac that I'm going to decrease the pressure. So now it is the low pressure. Outside world is high pressure. That's going to cause the air to move down the trachea and through the bronchial tree to the alveoli. This occurs during rest, which is normal and quiet inspiration, as the phrenic nerves stimulate the diaphragm to contract downward. So if this is, down here, I'm drawing around this, if this is the look of the thoracic cavity, if I take the diaphragm and pull it down, and I'll just pull it flat here, that means I have increased the space of the thoracic cavity by this much. So if I've increased the space, which means I've increased the volume, that means that I have decreased the pressure, or in other words, I've created low pressure. So if this is low pressure and then this is just X, normal, that means that it ends up being this, making it high pressure because it's higher than the cavity. Air comes in, moves down the trachea, into the bronchial tree to the alveoli. All right. Now, I'm not worried about you knowing the actual numbers. As far as I know, I haven't made this test yet, but I'm not interested in you knowing it. I don't think that I'm going to, if there's any questions, I will make sure that I have something that gives you the idea, but I will not ask questions with the specific number. Let's just put it that way. So inspiration is caused by lowering the diaphragm, which is going to cause increased volume, which is going to lower the pressure, cause low pressure, and cause air to go from the atmosphere into the lungs. Now, inspiration is almost entirely done by the diaphragm. All right, that's normal, quiet inspiration. The diaphragm is, we'll say, 99.9% of the thing doing the job. Now, when we have our thoracic cavity here, and if I want to add to the ability to breathe in, all right, so my diaphragm goes down, but now again, inhalation, I want to make the thoracic cavity larger. So if I can take and pull the ribs outward, that helps increase the volume and decrease the pressure. So when I'm laboring to breathe, if I'm running or doing some sort of exercise, it's going to be my external intercostal muscles that are going to help. And remember, muscles can only pull, they cannot push. And so if I want to cause this wall to move outward, I have to be on the outside. So the external intercostal muscles aid in inspiration. Now, Lung expansion is added by the surface tension of the pleural cavity. What it's saying is between the visceral and parietal pleura, there is surface tension between those two membranes, a suction basically. So as the thoracic cavity, the ribs get pulled out, the visceral pleura, because it's kind of stuck to the parietal pleura, gets pulled out. Now, surfactant helps reduce the surface tension in the alveoli to help the lung expansion. I believe we talked about this. If we haven't, I'll explain it more as we go along here. But surface tension is the tension of the molecules at the surface of a liquid, especially water droplet. That's why water, if you put a drop of water on a wax surface, because there's not a lot of tension here at the point where the water and the surface meets, you'll see that the water will ball up into a almost complete ball. And that's because of the way the molecules at the surface are more attracted to each other than the ones in the middle. I'll go over this again in a little bit later on, but that's what happens. That's called surface tension. And so the surfactant, which is something our body is going to produce to help reduce the surface tension in the lungs, is going to aid to it. Again, we'll talk about surfactant a lot more as we go on. A deep, forceful maximal inspiration requires the contraction of other muscles, which mainly are going to be the external intercostal muscles to help enlarge the cavity. Again, this is a little picture showing the inspiration. So the external intercostal muscles are going to pull the ribs up and out. The diaphragm is going to flatten out as it contracts, and that's going to cause an increase in the volume, and that's going to cause a decrease in pressure, causing low pressure. So major events of inspiration, the impulses are conducted on the phrenic nerve. You need to know that. The phrenic nerve, you don't need to know about the phrenic nerve. You just know that is what is going to contract the diaphragm. As the diaphragm moves downward, the thoracic cavity expands. That just simply means that's the easy way of saying that I have increased the volume. And if I know I increased the volume, then I know that means that I have decreased the pressure. And if I have a decreased pressure, that means I have a low pressure, and the high pressure is going to move in to try and fill it. At the same time, the external intercostal muscles are going to contract, which is going to expand the thoracic cavity further. Interalveolar pressure decreases. Atmospheric pressure will end up being high compared to the low pressure in the alveoli, and that's going to cause air to move into the respiratory tract and fill the lungs with air. Expiration is going to have a couple of things that are going to be used for it. So forces responsible for normal resting expiration. Just on a normal thing, there's going to be two big things. Really, one's called elastic recoil. The lung tissues and the abdominal organs, they have a lot of elastic fibers in them, and it's going to pull it back to the original shape. So if I stretch it out, it's going to be pulled back. Now, surface tension, we just talked about. I'm going to explain it a little bit more. This is going to be something that's going to happen. But the big one that's here, which I don't understand why it's not doing it, is the diaphragm, which was flattened out, is going to go back to its original spot, which is going to decrease the volume, going to cause air to be pushed out. Now, let's talk about surface tension and this thing called surfactant. Now, in another video, we're going to talk about how surfactant, this chemical our body produces in the lungs, is going to reduce surface tension. But if you've ever heard this saying, all right, now this little statement, well, let me just go back. Premature babies. When a baby is born premature, the main thing that is a hurdle to overcome is what the average person will say is their lungs are not developed. And that's not exactly true. It's only one type of cell. They're called type 2 cells. These cells in our lungs, these type 2 cells, produce surfactant. Now, surfactant is going to cause a reduction in surface tension. Now, little molecules of oxygen are going to have these little configurations where there are these oxygens at the middle, and you're going to have hydrogen bonds off to the sides. Well, if I'm looking at it in the inside of the fluid, they're going to have all kinds of different arrangements, and they're going to basically have the same forces on every side of them. But once we get up to the surface, the force that's on the surface is no longer there. So now they're going to form stronger bonds off to the side, because the force that was here, which is no longer here, ends up being shared equally on either side. So I'm going to have this layer of molecules at the surface which have a greater attraction to the ones off to their side, and that's what we call surface tension. So if I've got an alveoli like this and air's coming in, understand that we're going to be producing a lot of water as we breathe. And so water's going to ball up on the walls of this alveoli. And in our body, remember, they're just simple squamous cells, simple one cell layer thick of flattened cells. And they don't have enough structure that can resist the surface tension of water. So if I don't have surfactants, the surface tension of water is so strong it will cause my alveoli to collapse in on itself. And this is what happens with premature babies. Because the type 2 cells are not mature enough to produce surfactant, we have no way to combat the surface tension of the water molecules, and so little babies, premature babies' lungs will collapse because of that. Now, it doesn't disrupt the entire surface tension. It alleviates just enough that the surface tension is another thing that's going to aid to the elastic recoil. It is going to help bring the alveoli back in to push the pressure out. Now, again, I went over it. We're going to talk about this a lot more when we start talking about the cells that make up the lungs and get into this type 2 cell. But since it's been brought up twice in the 2 slides, I wanted to bring that up. Now, combining these 2 factors increase the intra-alveolar pressure, right? So I'm going to have a little bit of surface tension here. The surfactant, limits the amount of it, but that surface tension is going to still be enough to help bring it back. And then the elastic tissue is going to cause it to come back after it's been stretched. Under normal expiration, we have no real muscle contraction. And so if we have forced expiration, remember, so if I draw this little picture of the thoracic cavity here again, if I am trying to get this wall to move in, so again, I'm trying to decrease the volume, that's what causes expiration. I need to pull these walls together. And so since muscles can only pull, they can't push. If I want to pull the ribs inward, the muscle has to be inside. So it's called the internal intercostal muscles. That's what happens. Now I want to go back one more time to explain this part, passive. In our body, there's 2 types of processes, active processes and passive processes. We looked at this when we studied the first couple of chapters in 210. When we're talking about moving things across a membrane. If it costs energy, it's active. If it doesn't require energy, it's passive. So I do want you to know that breathing out under normal conditions, expiration, is a passive process. The only active process of breathing is inspiration. To breathe in, it requires activation. It requires energy to flatten that diaphragm down. And so inspiration is an active process where expiration is a passive process. So this is going back over the same thing. The abdominal area is going to be pushed up because the diaphragm is going to go back up. The internal intercostal muscles, if we need to aid in inspiration, are going to pull the ribs back in. So the major events of expiration, the diaphragm and the external respiratory muscles relax. Elastic tissue of the lungs stretched during inspiration will recoil. The surface tension pulls the alveolar walls back in. Tissues recoiling around the lung increase the interalveolar pressure, and then air is pushed out of the lungs.